ahead and get started. Looks like we have about 22 people that have joined us so far. Thank you very much. If you could, in the chat, if you can kind of just type where you're coming from or where you're at tonight. And while you're doing that, I'll kind of give you an overview of what United Survivors is for anybody this may be their first webinar. It's our mission, and we bring all lived experience together into one area under one umbrella to help provide support for each other and help them learn to share our stories in a way to help save lives. Currently, we have 3 primary focuses on how we're doing that. One of those is offering these free webinars monthly. The other one is we are involved in the National Workplace Guidelines that was released on October 10th of this year with a partnership with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the American Association of Suicidology and the United Survivors. We also have an online course through Udemy on storytelling. And I encourage everybody to join us. You can do that going to our website at unitesurvivors.org. A little housekeeping, we are recording the webinar, and hopefully it's going to be playing on Facebook Live, so you can engage there as well. Please share it with your network. Participants will be muted throughout the webinar, but you can post questions, comments, and resources through the chat, and the speaker will address all questions at the end. It's my privilege and honor to get to introduce our speaker tonight. Sarah Gare is a clinician and suicide prevention specialist with Riverside Trauma Center, a program of Riverside Community Care based out of Needham, Massachusetts. She is co-chair of the Pioneer Valley Coalition for Suicide Prevention in Western Massachusetts and as an active member of the Executive Committee for Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention. Sarah has over 20 years working in the mental health field with a focus on substance use disorders, trauma, and suicide. She is a passionate public speaker and author, having recently published her first novel, The Price, and preparing to publish several more. Sarah is also a member of the Board of Directors on United Survivors. Her topic tonight is Beyond the Brain, Soul Exhaustion, and Suicide Prevention. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you to everybody for joining this webinar. I'd actually like to start off by giving some disclaimers, which I think are often important. The first one I'm not that thrilled about. It's that the term soul exhaustion is not my own. I had hoped that it would be, but after having sort of come up with it in my mind, I did some Googling, and it turns out it's been used a fair amount in other places. If you look it up, what you will find is it's predominantly been used in the context of sort of more esoteric conversations. I also want to be really clear about the differences between religion, faith, and spirituality and the soul. You'll see that it's really difficult sometimes to parse these things out, but I'm going to do the best I can. When I talk about religion, I'm talking about organized religion. Faith is a much more personal thing for people, and then the soul is a very individual idea. I also want to just acknowledge that this concept is still very young in its development. It's one I've been working on for about a year now. I rolled it out for the first time ever at the Massachusetts State Conference in May. Got a lot of really strong feedback that people thought this was an important topic, so I'm working to grow it, which means, like most things in life, hopefully it will continue to evolve and get even stronger than it is right now. So with that said, I think it's really important to always start off with just a little bit of a moment to reflect on our own perspectives. And so the question I want to start our webinar off with tonight is, in your mind, what is the soul? So that's just a cute picture of my dogs. There's no meaning behind it other than I like to show them off. But if you could take a minute and jot down on a piece of paper, or if you're feeling pretty brave, you could put it in the chat box. What do you think that the soul is? All right, hopefully that gave you just a moment to share thoughts or write them down. And there's a reason why I'm asking you to do this. So we're gonna move on. The soul is something that actually gets talked about a lot. It's used in everyday language frequently. And that's not just true now, but it's actually been true for a really long time. So I went through and I found some quotes where people reference the soul, and I wanted to have a variety of different people and cultures and that sort. So Here we have Helen Keller, who said, character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved. Prayer is not asking, it's a longing of the soul, said Gandhi. For what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and suffer the loss of his soul? Jesus. Not everybody can be famous, but everybody can be great. Greatness is determined by service. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love. Martin Luther King Jr. The soul within me, no man can degrade. Frederick Douglass. Ordinary riches can be stolen, real riches cannot. In your soul, you are infinitely precious things cannot be taken from you. Oscar Wilde. I think this is a really interesting quote here. Electric communication will never be a substitute for the face of someone who their soul encourages another person to be brave and true. Charles Dickens. In 2017, actually, Joe Biden said, we're all living through a battle for the soul of our nation. And Maya Angelou, who said so many brilliant things, but said this, a great soul serves everyone all of the time. A great soul never dies. It brings us together again and again. And so you can see that this term soul has been used in many ways and continues to be used in modern times. And it's also been translated into many, many languages. If you are interested in doing some research, you will see that this is an idea that has been global. It can be traced through many different religions, many, if not all nations. This is an idea that appears to have a really strong kind of multicultural impact. So for the sake of this webinar, though, I want to be really clear when I use the term what I'm referring to. I am referring to the essence of a human being, their individuality and their humanity. So for some people, when they talk about the soul, and again, this is something you can find if you do some research on it, there's this idea of it being a part of us that lives beyond our death, as it being something that's entirely separate from our physical being. Some religions actually feel that it's that our soul lives within our blood. There was a scientist many years ago who tried to measure the weight of the soul. So there's a lot of different ideas, but for the sake of this conversation, the way that I'm looking at the soul is the essence of a human being. With that said, I became really interested in where the soul went in the field of psychology. And you know, if you look up the word psychology in itself, it comes from the Greek word psyche. And the Greek word psyche originally meant breath, spirit, soul, or mind. And of course, it's the study of. And yet in modern day psychology, what we're really looking at is the mind or the brain. So I decided to do a word cloud and just see what words do people use most often in the context of the soul. And as you can see here, it was language like created, dream, nature, beautiful, grace, playing, freedom, God. So it really sort of gives you a sense of when people think of the word soul, what they're thinking of. And somehow this idea moved really far away in the field of psychology. And if you look back at the Greek philosophers and all of those people, they still talked a lot about the soul. So I became interested in how and why did we move so far away from this concept where psychology really became only about the mind or the brain and not about those other things. And I found this gentleman, William Wundt, and he gets blamed to some extent for this. I think there were probably a lot of people involved in this change of direction. But in 1911, William said the soul can no longer exist in the face of our present day physiological knowledge. What's interesting, I had always thought that Sigmund Freud was the father of psychology. I must have been told that somewhere. But if you look that up, it actually turns out Sigmund Freud is considered to be the father of psychoanalysis, not the father of psychology. And this gentleman here is considered to be the father of psychology. What's interesting about him, he opened what is known to be the first experimental laboratory for psychology in Germany in 1879, and he was the first person to refer to himself as a psychologist. So it's interesting to think about how one person can start to shift the narrative so much and change a culture and a belief. here we had Dr. Osler, excuse me, who in 1904, he seemed to have the same concerns that I have now. And he said, modern psychological science dispenses altogether with the soul. Science minimizes to the vanishing point the importance of the individual. And this is something that we hear from people every single day who have lived experience with suicidality, with suicide loss, with the mental health system, with mental health care, is that they often feel that they've become just a series of check boxes and that they're no longer being seen as an entire human being. And so I thought, well, here's this sort of voice that's standing up for the essence of being a human being. But we continued in the same direction that we were on. And part of that, I'm going to blame Freud. I blame Freud for a lot of things. And I'm going to blame him in part for this as well. And the reason I'm blaming him is because he had a colleague he worked very closely with whose name was Otto Rank. And in fact, Otto Rank's book that I'm going to talk about was a part of the inspiration and research for me to really think about this. Otto Rank and Freud had a big falling out, which, if I remember correctly, was pretty consistent with Freud. He had lots of falling outs. But as part of that, Otto Rank went on to write a book called The Psychology of the Soul after their falling out. And that was dismissed almost entirely by the psychology and psychoanalysis field. And in fact, not only was it dismissed, but it was chalked up to being evidence of Otto Rank's mental illness, which I think is pretty devastating. It effectively greatly shifted or continued to shift the conversation around this idea of the soul. Now, this is one of those areas where I'm going to get a little confusing because I'm going to throw religion into this, but I'm going to circle back around to this. Freud said of religion is comparable to a childhood neurosis. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it's painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. And so when you think about the soul as oftentimes being connected in idea to religion, and this being Sigmund Freud's perception of religion, you can see how he might have reacted to the conversation around the soul. The reason I think this is so important, what you're looking at here is a graph from Pew Research in 2014. And the survey asked the question around the belief in God. And what we see is that 63 of Americans reported that they believe in God absolutely certainly. 20% fairly strongly believe in God. And then 5% think that it's likely. That's 85% of Americans believe in this idea. And if they believe in this idea of God and religion, then there's a really good chance that they also believe in the idea of having a soul. And so if the major influencers in the field of psychology felt the way Sigmund Freud did, and the science does, and the medical model perhaps does, how does that connect to the people that we are trying to help and serve? And so I posed that question. So then I decided to take it a step further and compare a word cloud between the word psychology, which is the one with the black outline, and the word soul. In the left-hand side, I've put up some of the differences. So under the word psychology, you see words like task, temporal, participants, cognitive, evidence, perceptual. And on the right, under soul, you see things like freedom, created, loved, beautiful, God, and awaken. That's a pretty dramatic difference in perception and in the way of thinking about people. And this seemed really important to me. So here we are with our medical model. I want to be really clear. I'm not being anti the medical model. What I'm trying hopefully to do is demonstrate that there may be a part of humanity that is getting left out of this model. So what we have now is the model that really focuses on the mind and oftentimes specifically the brain and the body, but is leaving, in all too many cases, this conversation about the soul out. What's interesting is that we often find ourselves frustrated when we work within the faith community, because sometimes what we experience is that faith leaders will focus an awful lot on the idea of the soul or the spirit and not a lot on the other pieces. So My personal belief is that the truth usually lies somewhere in the middle, and my hope is perhaps to bring us a little bit closer to that place. So that just gives you a little bit of background, hopefully a foundation to the rest of the conversation. And I want to share with you how this idea of soul exhaustion specifically came to me. This is in New Hampshire. This is a place called Lonesome Lake in the White Mountains. I happen to be a huge, huge lover of the White Mountains. On the left is a picture of just the lake. So to explain to you the name of the lake, basically you have to hike up to the top of the mountain. And when you get there, instead of it being the top of an actual mountain, you come to this beautiful lake. What's really interesting about Lonesome Lake is when you drive around below it, you have no idea that there's a lake at the top. So I was in the White Mountains looking for a hike to take my two, again, I'm showing off my two beautiful dogs, to take my two dogs on. And I found this blog about, you know, these short and sweet New Hampshire hikes. And I thought, short and sweet, that's perfect for me because I'm not a professional hiker by any means. And this was a really good reminder about the importance of perspective. So it turns out if you're a really strong hiker, you might consider this to be a short and sweet hike. But if you're me, this is a pretty strenuous hike, almost straight uphill for a really long time. And so you get to the top and you think about quitting many times on the way, but you get to the top and you're grateful that you stayed with it, and it's just stunning. And you're glad you did it. But then about halfway down the mountain, I started thinking about doing things like just sitting on my rear end and sliding the rest of the way because I was so tired. And then I made a terrible mistake, which was that night I decided to force myself to go out to dinner because that had been the plan, and I had saved my favorite restaurant for the last night, and it turned out that I was really too tired, and I spent the majority of the dinner on the brink of tears. And so as I'm sitting there at dinner and I'm reflecting on how incredibly physically exhausted I am, and I thought to myself, I've never ever been this physically exhausted. And then a couple minutes later, that little voice in my head said, yes, you have. And I had to reflect on it and think about, when have I been this tired? And it occurred to me that the other time in my life that I had experienced that level of exhaustion, where I literally felt like I just had nothing left, was when my best friend died by suicide. And, you know, I sat there and I really reflected on that, because that exhaustion was different. It had a physical element for sure, but the cause wasn't physical. And the primary component of it wasn't physical. And that's when it occurred to me that when I lost her, it was actually my entire soul, or the essence of my being, that was exhausted. And so from there was born this idea in my mind about soul exhaustion. So when I talk about soul exhaustion, what is it exactly that I'm thinking about? Soul exhaustion is when every aspect of your being is exhausted, all of your internal resources are depleted. And I clearly remember when I experienced this, everything was effort. It just felt like there's nothing left in me. Soul exhaustion can absolutely resemble depression, except that its causes are environmental and experiential, and most likely the individual knows that, not necessarily neurological or biological. With that said, depression and other mental health conditions can increase the risk that somebody's going to experience soul exhaustion, and vice versa. Soul exhaustion, significant enough and severe enough and long enough, I believe, can increase the risk that someone is going to develop an underlying or an additional mental health condition. In my mind, as I was sort of breaking down what soul exhaustion is, it shares a lot in common with what we often talk about as being burnout, except instead of it being career related, it's life related. Sometimes it can be experienced as a slow rusting out, just a daily grinding that drains us completely, but sometimes it can be an event that feels like it's taken everything from us. This was a really interesting experience. There's a gentleman out there, I have a ton of respect for him. His name's Eduardo Vega. He's a good friend of United Survivors, and he does a lot of work talking about the importance of including people with lived experience in every conversation. So he had this shirt on when I saw him in Ireland that I really liked. It said, "Nothing about us without us." And so the first place that I took this idea wasn't to my colleagues. The first place I took this idea was to a treatment facility that I was running groups at. And so I asked the residents in the substance use disorder treatment program what they thought about this idea of soul exhaustion, and was it something that they could relate to. And overwhelming people, people really did relate to it. And it was really interesting because most days when I asked the question, I would say, you know, what do you think the symptoms of soul exhaustion would be? How do you think soul exhaustion happens? What makes this happen? But this one day, for some reason, I actually worded it, what would soul exhaustion look like? And one of the residents said, it's our intake picture. And for those of you who aren't familiar with substance use treatment facilities, it's pretty common to take a photograph of people when they come in on their first day. So instantly, everyone in the room agreed. Because of course, by the time you are desperate and scared and tired enough to check yourself into substance use treatment, you are probably experiencing pretty severe soul exhaustion. So that visual was really, really powerful for me and for them. So what are the things that exhaust our soul? I want to be clear about this slide. It's meant to reflect battery packs, but I don't want to give the impression that any one thing drains it more than any other. These things can happen at different times in different ways, and they can drain in different ways as well. So on the left-hand side, the first pack with the 2 rows, what you see there is oppression. And I do feel that this is a really important piece to think about. Oppression happens in many, many different ways. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but we can be looking at sexism, racism, family secrets. We have the word stigma up there, and there's a lot of pushback on that word, and I actually agree with the pushback. So the pushback is that when you talk about stigma, it's as if it's this idea that sort of just freely exists. What we're really talking about, though, is prejudice and discrimination and judgment, right? And also this mentality of man up. Right, that these things can exhaust our soul. Obviously, we know that not having basic needs met with stability can also exhaust people. So at the bottom, we're talking, it says lack, we mean lacking of, but people experiencing poverty, hunger, homelessness, sickness, food insecurity, instability in their housing, inability to access medical care, all of those things drain people's souls. And then I have on the next bar, I have the focus on, because so often people come into treatment or therapy and they're looking for help and support, and the focus ends up becoming on their neurology instead of all of the things that are happening in their life. And that, I believe, can also exhaust their soul, because instead of feeling like they're being heard and they're being seen for what they're facing in their life, they feel that they're just being chalked up to DNA and genetics and mental illness. And so the focus on mental illness as a concept and addiction as a concept and substance use disorders as a concept, we focus on those as the problem, when many people will tell you that those are what happened because of the problems. And unfortunately, in all too many cases, because we then focus on those things instead of what's really draining someone's soul, that can end in people losing their freedom, whether that be through a forced hospitalization, forced medication. Unfortunately, we are seeing rises in the number of people who are incarcerated, and let's be very clear about that. It's disproportionate between different groups of people, so that oppression piece comes back into place when it comes to incarceration. And then the cash business, what I'm talking about there is that many organizations are for-profit industries, which means that oftentimes what's in the best interest of the individual, the human being who's there for help, isn't the top priority. The top priority is revenue. And this isn't just true for for-profit industries, it's also unfortunately true for the insurance industry, who often the decisions being made for people are not based on need and what they need the most. And then the next bar is looking at some of the sort of more significant things, at least appearing on the outside to be more significant. I have the adverse childhood experience study. One of the next slides is going to talk a little more about that, because I think that's a really, really important concept that we're learning a lot about, but also loss and grief. I have to tell you, in all of the conversations I've had, I have come to believe that nothing drains the soul or the essence of a person's being more than grief does. I think that that's probably one of the top causes here. But trauma, abuse, abandonment, exposure to violence, whether that violence is in our communities or a war zone or in our own homes. I believe that that also exhausts our soul. And what is that exhaustion when that person reaches that place where there's no bars left? What does that exhaustion look like? It can look like a lack of focus. It can look like depression, lost will, automation, where the person feels really detached from everything around them, including friends and families, and maybe even most importantly, themselves. And ultimately, it can show up as being hopelessness and despair. The other thing I want to mention, and this came up in my conversations with people about this idea of soul exhaustion, people talked actually often about, I would take better care of my soul, except I haven't got the time. And I think for a lot of people in our communities, this is true, and it's especially true right now. Americans are working more hours than ever. In fact, in some countries, their work hours are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and yet in the United States, our work hours seem to be getting longer and longer and longer. And for so many people, they are spending all of their time, working and trying to take care of their home and trying to take care of their families. And so there's very, very little time for them to invest in themselves and in their own soul care. So really just understanding when people say, I don't have time, we tend to brush it off and say, well, you just need to make something more of a priority. For some people, that's not their reality. They can't just make things more of a priority. So really having an acknowledgement of that. And I'm guessing for many of you tuning in right now, you can really relate to this idea, because I don't think that this is just people who are showing up needing any type of mental health service. I think this is true for an awful lot of people in our communities and for ourselves included. So back to the oppression idea. Again, I think this is really important. The piece of oppression is understanding that oppression is a system that people are born into. And so they're not only born into this being already what's in existence, but then they continue to be socialized in it throughout their lifespan. And so at the earliest stages of life, when this message is continuously being given to them, they have very little ability to fight that off, because kids have very little ability to fight off what adults are teaching. And I'm not blaming the adults. I want to be really clear, because the truth is the adults were also born into the system. And so they've gone through this entire cycle themselves. Not only are we socialized in it initially, but then we continue to have these socializations reinforced throughout our lifespan, from church to school to the media to the legal system to the mental health system. And so not only is it reinforced constantly, but then it's also enforced, and we become stigmatized and put into categories, right? And oftentimes people face a tremendous amount of discrimination. So when we think about the groups of people, and really in some ways it's the majority of Americans fall into one of these groups when you think about it, but we could be looking at gender, we could be looking at people who have a mental health diagnosis, sexual orientation or identity, race, culture, language, learning differences, religion, social class, and other things. And the result in this, in my view, here it says dissonance, anger, dehumanization, guilt, ignorance, self-hatred, stress, lack of reality. To me, I would say the result of this is very likely to also be soul exhaustion. So I want to think about, what would this idea of soul exhaustion look like in children? And so here's a little girl. I want to ask you to just look at first the picture at the bottom and sort of in the middle. You can see she's probably, I'm guessing, 2 or 3 years old. This is all the same little girl. I'm guessing she's 2, maybe 3. And that's a picture of her. And as you can see, she is not looking up at the camera. She doesn't appear to be very engaged there. And then ask you to look at the picture right above that. That's a school picture. This does not look like a super happy little child. And then the picture to the right is her as a flower girl in the wedding. And so, as you might know, United Survivors, which I'm proud to be on the board of directors of, a lot of the work that we do is around helping people tell their stories. And one of the challenges with storytelling that we ask people to really reflect on is, what parts of your story involve telling someone else's story? For me, I had to think a lot about this, because in case you haven't guessed, this little girl is me. And in order for me to share parts of this story, it would mean sharing other people's story. And I don't actually feel comfortable with that component. So what I'm going to do right now is share with you my parts. So to give you a little background of this little girl, by the time she was 5, she had, her parents had divorced, and she had lost her home, her bedroom, her dad, her neighborhood. She had switched schools. She had gained a new stepdad. She had gained a new home, 3 new step siblings, and also changed schools. In the midst of all of that, she had also lost her grandmother. This is a little girl who had an awful lot going on around her. And so, you know, I think back to this child. And so as I've been really contemplating this idea of soul exhaustion, it occurred to me, I think as a little kid, I consistently experienced this idea of soul exhaustion because it was the essence of my being. And when you're a child, you're trying really hard to figure out who you are, how you fit into the world around you. And the messages that I was getting pretty consistently was that I didn't fit into the world around me. The story I think that probably stands out the most for me is when I was in the 2nd grade. 1st grade was pretty tough, a lot of transition, really struggling to figure out how to fit into my new school, really struggling to figure out how my new home and family worked. And but I was relieved when I started 2nd grade. I had this wonderful teacher who was Mrs. Kilbasa, and I'm not proud to tell you, I still think her name is funny. And I absolutely loved Mrs. Kilbasa. And part of the reason I loved her is she had a big gold poster up in the back of her room that was the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so I really felt that Mrs. Kilbasa was a safe place for me. I struggled to connect with the kids around me. I struggled to feel like I fit in anywhere. But I felt like I fit in with Mrs. Kilbasa. And she really confirmed this for me when she bought us all a Christmas gift. And I remember this so clearly. She actually had gone out on medical leave. And even on medical leave, she had gone out and bought a book for every one of her students. It was the same book. We all got the same book. But on the inside cover of mine, she wrote, "I chose this book because I know you love horses." And the book was The Black Stallion. And that meant so much to me as this little tiny kid. Well, I go on Christmas vacation and I come back and I dreaded school. So there I am standing at the bus stop, which was my driveway, with my backpack on, and it's cold out. And I climb up on the bus, and as soon as I get there, one of the kids looks at me and says, "Mrs. Kilbasa died." And I distinctly remember yelling at him and saying, "No, she didn't. I know she didn't die. I hate you. I hate you so much for telling me she died." And I get to school and I'm just shaken. I'm shaken to the very core. And we get ushered into our classroom and we're sitting in a circle and the principal walks into the classroom and he announces that Mrs. Kilbasa had died. And in that moment, I just felt paralyzed. And it's really interesting thinking back on this. I don't know what I did. My recollection is that my mother had to come and get me from school. And I feel like this is what got the wheels really turning into people realizing that I was not okay. Within a fairly short period of time, I want to say within the next year, I was taken to Boston Children's Hospital, which at the time was the leading expert in understanding what was happening with kids. I want to point out the picture down below. That hand is my mom trying to lift my chin. And I think that's really important because we have a tendency to blame families for kids who are struggling. And the outcome of that is that families often don't share all of the things that have happened because they're so afraid of the judgment and the punishment that can come. And let's be fair, sometimes that punishment is very real. Sometimes the Department of Children and Families becomes involved. Sometimes children are taken from their homes. And I think this is an area we really have to do better. So I'm taken to Boston Children's Hospital. And now, as you can imagine, I'd ask you to just think about it. Some of the symptoms that I had, I was very antsy. I struggled to focus. I was having difficulty learning. And I was impulsive. So if you have to guess, sitting there, what do you think the diagnosis is? If you guessed attention deficit, you would be correct. So this is about 1985, and I'm diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity. The issue with this is that instead of recognizing all of the things that had been happening and acknowledging the impact of those things on the essence of my being as a child, I am pathologized. And when you pathologize a child, they're going to believe you. They don't have any choice. And so we look at this kid and we say, there's something wrong with you. And it's not just the doctors who say it, it's the teachers who say it, it's the families who believe it because the experts are saying it. And the problem is we create a child who grows up as the essence of their being, as their soul is forming, truly believing that something is broken in them. And so I think it's really important to think about if we could create a system that allowed families to safely tell us all the things that are happening, that allowed children to feel safe in telling us all the things that were happening, could we possibly avert some of this? I know this is probably going to be a strikingly unpopular statement, but as somebody who started taking stimulants, I think in the 3rd grade, I actually really believe that someday we're going to view the medicating of children similarly to how we look back on ice baths in this field. I think someday we're going to feel like this is not the right route for most children. I'm not saying not for any, but I'm saying probably not for many. And part of that is this starting to really understand the impact of adversity on children. So this is the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. It yielded a tremendous amount of really important information. If you're not familiar with it, I would really encourage that you learn more about it. It can not only help if you work in the field to understand things better, although I think most people in the field are pretty familiar, but if you're here because you're curious for yourself, you might find that some of the information in that study really helps you understand that as well. So the ACE study, what it looked at was these 10 specific categories: emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, a mother treated violently in the household. You can read the rest. But what I would ask you to think about is if we have a mom who is being treated violently in the household, what's the likelihood that there's household substance use? It's high. What's the likelihood if we have a mom who's under terrible distress or a dad who's under terrible distress? What's the likelihood that there's some emotional neglect? It's pretty good. So what we know about childhood adversity is that where you have one, you're more likely to have more. And the research is overwhelmingly not only looking at health outcomes, so looking at things like heart disease, asthma, diabetes, but it also looks at mental health conditions, and behavioral health issues. So here, the graph that I've put here is the correlation or the connection between childhood adversity and chronic depression, because that's the medical model, right? Is that we're going to call this chronic depression. What you see to the left in that is if there's zero childhood adversity, that's the risk for chronic depression. I'd ask you to look at that 4 or more. So when we have somebody who's had 4 or more of those incidences, that's the likelihood of chronic depression. So of course, I can't help but pose the question, is it possible that what we're dealing with here isn't chronic depression, meaning something that's not working right in the brain? Is it possible that this is actually a form of soul exhaustion, that this person's being has been exhausted down to nothing? And what is the consequence when, especially a developing soul or spirit or individual, what's the consequence of being in chronic instability and distress on them? And if we think about that, the next question, of course, is what are the solutions? The solutions right now are often therapy, specialized groups, medication, those sorts of things. But if we think about this not as being a mental health disorder, but rather being something that's happening to the essence of that person, what are the possible solutions there? So when I think about soul exhaustion as a model, it is a trauma-informed concept. So it's asking the question, what has happened to you or what is happening to you, instead of asking the question of what's wrong with you. And the goal is to remove the blame from the individual. And I just want to highlight again, we also have to work really hard to remove the blame from the families, because odds are, if we peel the onion back, they've also experienced a lot of these things themselves. We also want to prove, I believe that soul exhaustion would prove to be more culturally relatable for many groups of people. I had the great honor of working pretty extensively with the Bhutanese culture in Western Massachusetts after the tornadoes. And for them, the medical model was very, very foreign. It was not something that they related to. And yet the idea of the soul or the spirit was something that they related to. I also think that this greatly increases the possible solutions to a person's suffering, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. And it inherently acknowledges the complexity. We're not just blaming someone's situation or their mental health on a disorder or them. We're acknowledging that human suffering is very complex, and human beings are very complex. And so when we think about the classic ideas of self-care, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying that this stuff doesn't matter. What I'm saying is I think that it's yes and, right? So the classic self-care we tend to focus on is things like diet and exercise, sleep, obviously really important when we look at suicide. There's such a strong correlation between insomnia and suicide risk. So we know that these physical things are really, really important. Having access to healthcare, having competent healthcare, and going to healthcare, hygiene, mental health, and family, these are all really, really important. So this is a yes and. Yes and. Shouting self-care at people who actually need community care is how we fail. This really, really struck me, that oftentimes we're out there and we're just focusing on this idea of self-care, meaning the last slide, and we're not recognizing the role of the community and of humanity in that. And so I think that we need to think beyond just sort of those ideas. And I want to be clear, there's a lot of wonderful therapists out there who are already doing all of this. So I don't want to imply that the average person in this work doesn't get it. I do want to say, for all the conferences I go to, I hardly ever hear these ideas come up. And so that's part of what motivated me to look at this and to then talk about it. And so what does soul health look like? What does it require for us to have soul health? Basic necessities is a sense of community, friends, peers, family, intimacy. Obviously our basic needs, shelter, food, safety, health, freedom. We can do all the therapy we want with somebody, but if they're facing homelessness and they can't find food, we're not going to fix the soul exhaustion. So this is really important. I also want to just go back up to that peer place. There's been a huge movement in the mental health field, in the suicide prevention field, in peer support, and I can't stress enough the importance of people hearing words like "me too." It's great to have people who love you and care about you and are there for you, but sometimes the most important thing we can have is somebody who looks at you and says, "I get it, and I know how that felt for me." And so even though no two people's experiences are exactly the same, there's still something really, really powerful, and we saw this in the Me Too movement. But also that sense of self. You know, one of the things I've thought about after returning from Ireland for 3 weeks, which was amazing and totally soul care, was the role of culture here in the United States. And so I actually asked some people, like, what is American culture? And I got answers back like football, hot dogs, American pie, or excuse me, apple pie. That was really interesting to me because, you know, it made me think about how the process, we talk sometimes about the process of being an immigrant, and what it's like to find yourself in sort of that culture shock. Then we also look at the impact on second generation immigrants, and we look at suicide risk for those folks in particular. But we often don't talk about what it is to be a third or fourth or fifth or sixth generation immigrant, when you no longer have some of that really strong cultural tie to what it meant to be Italian or Irish or Polish or Portuguese, right? And I'm not sure if the United States, if we've really figured out what our culture is yet. We're still a really young country and a really young culture. And so I'm not sure if this melting pot thing is working out the way. Of course, there's a lot of people who say we've never been a melting pot, we're a tossed salad. And then there's people who don't like that expression either. I don't have feelings about any of that, except to say, I wonder if we need a lot more culture for people. And then that connection to faith and spirituality, a sense of identity. And also feeling that that sense of identity is accepted. We see without argument the impact on our LGBT community, especially youth, when people don't accept their identity. There's been some recent research looking at transgender youth and the impact of being called their chosen name and how incredibly important that is. So their soul health is having people respond to them with care and acceptance, including embracing whatever that identity is. And then connection and family, and also having opportunity that people really need for soul health. They need to feel that there's opportunity in front of them, whether it be for an employment or education, to own a home, for property, for those types of things. I am a huge, huge fan of Viktor Frankl and have been for a really long time. Viktor Frankl, if you haven't read him, wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He was a prisoner in Auschwitz a very long time ago, and he was also a physician there. And he developed a model called logotherapy. I'm just making sure that I'm not late. Logotherapy, and it really looked at the importance for people in having meaning in their life. And so I think that that's something we don't really talk enough about. And then having the opportunity to take action and make a difference. So a sense of purpose and being able to use our creativity. I believe that these are the things that are going to fuel soul health. And so for soul care, we need culture, art, nature, identity, meaning, creativity, music. I just was reading an article about the power of dance and the impact on depression, which was really interesting and not surprising at all to me. Spirituality, ceremony. We know that being part of ceremony is very, very important for people. And it's interesting because one of the things that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years is a real decrease in people going to church. So now here's a moment where I'm going to mix together religion and soul just a little bit. But when we think about church, a lot of people think of it as only religion, or only God, but actually church is a lot more than that for many people. For many people, it is their connection to their community. It is their culture. It is a place where they find meaning. It's a place where they find their spirituality and they share in that with other people. And it's ceremony. And so church is about a lot more than just one thing. So I can't help but wonder if part of the despair that we do see might be in some ways related to people attending places of worship less often than they used to. Obviously, we all know there's some concerns about religion and church as well. I'm not dismissing that, but I am suggesting that for many, many people, church is a place where they actually, for an hour a week, church or temple or the mosque is a place where for an hour a week they take care of their soul. So what does soul care look like in suicide prevention? What am I thinking about? How often are we asking people about their spiritual beliefs? How often are we engaging faith leaders, both in the suicide prevention world, but also in people's care? Do we respect people's religious beliefs, or do we say things like Sigmund Freud, like that religion is infantile? Do we respect the power that faith holds for many, many people? And do we truly listen to what people with lived experience are telling us, or are we always filtering them through the medical model in our mind as we listen? Are we listening for those check boxes of diagnosis? So my call to action to each of you, and then we're gonna turn over for some questions if there are any. My call to action is one, we all need to confront our own feelings about spirituality. Don't be Freud. He did a lot of great things. I don't mean to bash Freud, but don't be Freud. We need to start talking to people more about the role of spirituality in their healing and lives, and at least understand what they believe and what they feel. We want to make sure that we're including faith leaders, especially in the larger conversations around suicide prevention, because we know many people do turn to their faith leaders. And also my personal plea to all of you as a child who was pathologized and a child who was given the impression that something was terribly broken and had to do years and years and years of work to realize that that wasn't the case. I was actually behaving and experiencing what was pretty predictable considering the context of all the things that I had experienced. So I'm going to ask you to please hesitate and push back on this pathologizing and diagnosing of people that we're trying to help. And this is where I think we need to go, where we're actually incorporating the mind, the body, and the essence of people's being into our conversations. So if you're thinking, what about this? Or she didn't mention that. I like the idea, but it was missing a lot. I totally agree with you. This was only an hour. And also this is still fairly young in its development. So you're right, but I would be more than happy to get any type of feedback of ways that I can expand on this, or your thoughts about soul exhaustion. I'm really appreciative to all of the people who have helped me formulate this. And if you want to email me, you can email me at sarahgare@gmail.com. Also, I just want to let you know I have created a couple of soul care worksheets that are on my website, totally free. You can print them out. They're under the resources, and I'm happy to have you take a look at that and see if it's something that you can use. Also, very happy to get feedback from folks on what they think of those resources. All right, Rick.
All right, great job, Sarah. A couple comments that were given. A couple of people are thankful that it's recorded. They can share with other people. Anne Marie would like to share with all the impacted friends and family. Kimberly says that she believes it should be weaved into all kinds of things, prevention and resilience. And then there were several comments of agreement as you were going on. I'm not sure exactly what parts were being agreed to, but it was good information. One question was, are you advocating for more of a social work orientated rather than psychological approach to humans?
Am I advocating for a more social work oriented?
Yes.
Rather than psychologically? That's the question?
That's the question.
So, yes, I am. I think, listen, there's no doubt. I've worked in this field for 20 years. There's no doubt in my mind that there are people who are impacted by some sort of mental illness that I don't fully understand. I think most people don't fully understand, and that medication can be extremely helpful for people. And that therapy can be extremely helpful for people. So I'm not minimizing that in any way. But I am concerned that not only as a field, but also as the systems in place, that we're often putting a lot more focus on that piece and not enough focus on the social work piece, which is helping people to have all of the other needs that they have met. So yes, I am advocating for that.
Okay. Couple of Sarah fantastic presentation comments. And then somebody stated that the ritual church can be quite comforting. I think reinforcing what you're saying. If anybody else has any questions for the next minute or two, please feel free to type them in. We can ask Sarah while she's here.
Great. Did you have any burning thoughts, Rick?
No, I really enjoyed the presentation, and I thought, I have definitely been to that soul exhaustion place several times in my life. I'm going to use some of the enhanced self-care, looking at it a little bit different way. So I think it was very beneficial.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you. All right.
All right. I think the last comment was, so grateful you're willing to share, and they'll be sharing it in some trainings and at their community level work, and a few more thank yous.
Oh, thank you so much, everybody, for giving me time. I know time is something we're all short of, and I really appreciate you choosing to spend it with me tonight. Thank you, and thank you, Rick.
Thank you. So remind everybody that you can find the webinar be recorded, and it will be on unitesurvivors.org and then our YouTube channel probably in about a week or so. So again, if you can join there, and look forward to seeing you next month. We'll make an announcement in the near future what the webinar will be next month. Thank you.
Thank you.